Good Saturday morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our weekly tropical weather outlook for today, Saturday, March 28th, 2026. This week, we're going to continue to talk about El Nino as we have been over the last several weeks, and it looks like very favorable conditions are coming up for El Nino development in the Pacific. I mean, it's already been expected that we will have an El Nino this year, but it looks like development of this El Nino is really going to speed up, and there are multiple factors as to why. I'm going to go over them, and we're also going to look at other things, tropics and non-tropics related as well. So glad to have you along for today's video. Hope you stick along, and let's get started by taking a look at how many days we are now till June 1st, which is the start of the Atlantic hurricane season. We are 65 days away, and we're continuing to get closer each and every single day, or each and every single week that passes by. Next week is going to be the start of April, at least when we do our tropical weather outlook for next week. It's going to be the start of April, and we're probably going to be under the 60-day mark, at least until June 1st. But another date that we should also be monitoring is how long till May 15th, because May 15th is the start of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, and especially in recent years, the National Hurricane Center has started doing daily tropical weather updates on May 15th for the Atlantic as well. So really, if you want to consider that the actual start of the hurricane season, since that's when we start with the daily tropical updates, that is only 48 days away, so even less than 65. We are well under 60 days until we get to that time frame. So it is definitely speeding up, and hurricane season is definitely on the fast approach, and it's only going to get quicker from here on out. All right, let's start the discussion part of this week's video with taking a look, as usual, at the sea surface temperature anomaly map from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch website. And what do we have this week? Well, we pretty much have the same as we've been talking about for the last several weeks. The Atlantic is decently warm, right where it should be, to slightly above normal throughout most of the deep tropics. The subtropical Atlantic is definitely much more above normal. The Gulf of Mexico is also very above normal. This is going to be interesting to watch for severe weather season, especially now that we are in the spring, and we are just a week away from April, actually slightly under a week away now. And April and May is the peak of severe weather season, so we're really going to have to monitor that very closely, because when we have a very warm Gulf of Mexico, that means extra moisture is available for big severe weather events. And I've also, a lot of people have been talking about that potentially we might see a big severe weather season this year, so that is definitely going to be a key factor for that, besides, when it comes to hurricane season. But the Atlantic is warm, but especially the Pacific here, you could just see just how much warmth that is now beginning to build in the Pacific. We have these warm anomalies developing off the coasts of South America, as again, we have our El Nino that is shaping up here later this year. But what's especially interesting is the very, very big warm pool here off the Baja Peninsula and off the southwest coast of the United States. This is something that we've not seen in recent years, and I've talked about this a little bit over the past several weeks, but this is really interesting to see that this just continues to build. And in general, just take a look at the entire Pacific. You could kind of see here, it is very, very warm, and believe it or not, this should actually be very interesting when it comes to El Nino, because especially if the northern Pacific here is warmer, that tends to couple much better with El Nino events that do happen. So that's potentially a factor working in favor of definitely us getting an El Nino this year. And I think it's already been established that we're going to get an El Nino, but especially when it comes to strength, that is something we're going to have to watch very closely, because especially if the northern Pacific is able to couple well with whatever El Nino that develops here later this year, maybe that could help aid in the El Nino being stronger, like a lot of the forecasts have been recently or a lot of the hype online has recently been hinting at. And I kind of, took a jab at it last week, but seeing how things are shaping up this week, honestly, maybe I might have to eat my words in terms of the fact that maybe we're not going to get a strong El Nino, because it's looking increasingly likely, especially with the conditions that are setting up over the next several weeks, that actually that scenario might indeed be happening. Let's take a look at the weekly latest sea surface temperatures, though, in the Pacific. And I decided to use the weekly CPC sea surface temperature map, or sea surface temperature value chart, instead of the typical daily NOAA Coral Reef Watch map that I get from Cyclonic Weather. And the latest weekly value, interestingly enough, is still for the Niño 3.4 region, at least as of this past week, at negative 0.6 degrees Celsius. So interestingly enough, we are actually still in La Nina territory in terms of the latest weekly SST departures from the official NOAA values. And I guess maybe that's partially because of the, extra calculations that they do with the relative oceanic Niño index, where they kind of filter out some background warmth that might be added to the values because of just in general how things are different, in this day and age, in terms of, the Earth is definitely much more warmer, so there's a lot more warmth everywhere, so you kind of have to factor that out, especially when we're talking about something like El Nino. Very complicated kind of calculation process, but interestingly enough, I find it kind of, I don't know, it's definitely curiosity piquing that the Niño 3.4 value, according to them, is still negative 0.6 degrees Celsius. Though the Niño 1 and 2, the area here closer to South America, which, there's been warmth building there quite, noticeably for the last several weeks. Definitely a big hint at El Nino coming later this year. And the Niño 1 and 2 region, by the way, is like right in here. You could definitely see we have a lot of warmth there, and that region is already very warm at positive 1.2 degrees Celsius. So, we're obviously still not in El Nino yet, but we're getting there, and I guess we're already starting to see the signs of things beginning to warm up in the Pacific, especially with this here and a lot of this warmth here in the subtropical and, just north of the equator. Definitely is a very interesting sign for the El Nino this year, and maybe that'll help aid in us getting a stronger El Nino this year, potentially. The SOI, on the other hand, still positive right now, and I've mentioned the SOI over the last several weeks. We are still in the positive territory, and in order to especially get an El Nino, you would want to see the SOI dip negative, because a negative SOI tends to align much better with El Nino atmospherically, because the SOI is a measure of the pressure patterns in the Pacific, and obviously that has a huge implications when it comes to how El Nino develops, because it determines, or it gives us an idea of how the trade winds are. But the SOI is still positive. The latest value from the 30-day average is positive 9. And we're still above La Nina threshold with the SOI, but if you look at the daily contributions from the last several days, we have been dipping into the negative territory. So maybe that is the sign of the atmosphere beginning to change, and especially if this persists for the next several weeks, we'll probably see the SOI crash pretty significantly, and maybe that'll help shift the atmosphere more in favor of El Nino. But I definitely think that that'll happen, because take a look at this. This is the zonal wind anomaly map. I bring this up basically every week now. And just look at what the GFS is forecasting here with the zonal winds in the Pacific over the next 2 weeks. And this is pretty incredible, if I'm going to be honest with you. A very, very strong westerly wind burst, focused mostly over the western Pacific, but that's actually kind of favorable in a way for El Nino development, and I'll explain more as to why in just a moment. But very, very strong westerly wind burst. In fact, the values here are pretty much off the chart, especially as we get in towards early April. And once again, this is focused over the western Pacific, and this is really probably going to help crash the SOI values very significantly. And especially if you just take a look at how this compares to the past several westerly wind bursts we've had, you could see they are slowly, progressively moving further eastward in the Pacific. And we're also starting to see a lot more of these trades here that we've had in the Pacific. Obviously, a remnant of the La Nina we had really died down, and we still have some that are going to go on here in the Eastern Pacific, but especially closer towards the Central and Western Pacific, things have really been warming up, and this is only going to help fuel that, and will only help continue to fuel El Nino development further. In fact, we're probably going to see the development of El Nino really speed up here in the next several weeks. And this westerly wind burst is really very strong, and if it does verify, it really might put the El Nino forecasts of people saying that we're going to get a strong El Nino this year. It gives a lot higher chance that those forecasts are going to verify. Let me just say that. And we'll have to see, whether or not this verifies, though. But something interesting that I did see, Eric Webb did say this, is twin tropical cyclones appearing in the west central Pacific, meaning tropical cyclones, as he's referring to, happening on the opposite sides of the equator, but in the general same area, in March and April is often a hallmark of a super El Nino. Obviously, something that has been very hyped on social media for the past several weeks, largely because of the gigantic westerly wind bursts that comes from it. And that is exactly what we have right now here in the Western Pacific, or roughly in that region. And he's saying that we might potentially get the chance for twin tropical cyclones to happen over the next several weeks. And you can see that here with the global tropical hazards map that he posted. And you could see, especially as we head in towards early April, we have a pretty decent tropical cyclone formation chance, one in the Western Pacific in the Northern Hemisphere, and then another potentially in the Southern Hemisphere in the South Central Pacific. And this is the twin tropical cyclone, situation that Eric Webb is talking about, and years that he mentions that this has happened. And I guess the point as to why he's saying this is because this is a huge hallmark that conditions are really becoming favorable for potentially a very strong El Nino this year. 2015, 1997, and 1982, all 3 years had this phenomenon happen around this time because we had a very strong westerly wind burst, and looks like that is coming up. And especially if this verifies, I think we are potentially really going to be in for a very strong El Nino event this year. So I found that interesting. We might potentially get twin tropical cyclones. And why is this favorable? Why is this going to fuel a strong El Nino? Even though, you might say that some of these westerly wind bursts that we're going to have here are really focused only in the Western Pacific. Well, what's going to happen is these very strong westerly wind bursts are going to fuel the warm pool in the Pacific, and it starts in the Western Pacific. And what it creates is a downwelling Kelvin wave of a lot of heat in the ocean that kind of gets drilled downward below the surface, and then it eventually pushes eastward, and then eventually surfaces in the Eastern Pacific. And then as this process continues, eventually the atmosphere begins to shift. We start to see, the pressures in the Pacific lower. We start seeing weaker trades, and eventually all this warm water that gets, sent down into the Pacific from the Western Pacific because of strong westerly wind bursts in the Western Pacific makes its way to the surface. And because of that, my friends, we have an El Nino. So this is definitely going to very much fuel the El Nino feedback, and very strongly over the next several weeks, especially if this magnitude of a westerly wind burst verifies. And, we might as well potentially get a very strong, maybe even that infamous super El Nino this year. And to, further that conversation, I decided to bring up the sea surface temperature anomaly map from 2015, which was when the last time we had a super El Nino. I think we all know that, especially if you are a avid hurricane tracker. 2015 was a very, very strong El Nino. And let's actually compare it to how it looks like this year so far. Sometimes maybe comparing past years to see where we were can give us a good idea of where we are potentially headed. And let's see, how does this year compare to how 2015 looks like so far? Well, for one thing, something that I do notice, and I did mention this, very, very warm, very, very widespread warmth here in the northern Pacific, especially off the west coast of the United States and off the coast of the Baja Peninsula here in Mexico. And by the way, what is this actually called? Or at least the warmth pool here closer towards the southwest coast of the United States and Mexico, that's specifically that part is called the PMM, the Pacific Meridional Mode. And then, of course, if you want to factor in the entire, northern Pacific, then we're talking about the PDO. But in general, if this is warm, that helps fuel El Nino development, especially if we have a developing El Nino. And I must say, the warmth here that we have right now is pretty similar to that of what we had in the last Super El Nino in 2015. The Atlantic, on the other hand, though, obviously much, much cooler in 2015 as it was today, but I'm not sure if that's really that relevant. And then what about here along the equatorial Pacific? I guess they were a little bit further along in 2015 with El Nino development. So maybe we still might not get as strong of an El Nino as 2015 was. 2015 was truly a super El Nino event. It really was, incredibly strong. And we probably are going to get a strong El Nino this year, but maybe not to that magnitude. But still, there are some similarities, and enough so that it does raise the question and, maybe raises that things might become a little bit more certain at this point, that we might potentially get a super El Nino this year. Obviously, we're going to have to wait and see and let everything verify, and let all of these model runs, especially in terms of showing a very strong westerly wind burst like this, we're going to have to see it verify first before we actually jump to the conclusion that we are going to get a super El Nino. But if this does verify, this is definitely the look of very favorable conditions coming up over the next several weeks in terms of the development of El Nino. But of course, we're going to have to wait and see whether or not all this actually comes together. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, let's take a look at the actual sea surface temperatures right now, instead of the sea surface temperature anomalies. There's a difference between anomalies and the actual sea surface temperatures. And let's take a look at the Gulf right now, especially since the Gulf is very warm. And you can see here the 26 degrees Celsius line here that is, kind of pokes out in the Gulf because of the Gulf Stream and the loop current. That's already making its way, pretty decently northward. It's already halfway through the Gulf in terms of how far north it reaches in latitude. And especially as we get towards the next several months, this is all going to warm up very significantly. And by the time we get to probably mid to late May, pretty much the entire Gulf will be filled with temperatures at least 26 degrees Celsius or higher. And trust me, it's going to happen very fast. You may not believe it, but it's going to happen very fast. And it's probably going to happen even quicker this year because of how warm things are already. As you can see, we already have 23 degrees Celsius readings here right off the coast of Louisiana, 22 off the coast of Texas. It's a little bit warmer, colder, I should say, in the northeastern Gulf. Temperatures getting as low as 19 degrees Celsius, but trust me, all of this is going to warm up. And probably by the time we get to late May, the entire Gulf is going to be 26 Celsius or warmer. The Gulf is always going to be warm enough for a tropical development for pretty much the entirety of hurricane season, no matter what, especially as we get towards the peak. That's just the nature of how the Gulf of Mexico is, in part thanks because, or I should say, in thanks to the Gulf Stream here, which transports warm water and heat from the Caribbean northward, and then it kind of gets entrapped in the Gulf of Mexico. And then it also flows off the southeast coast too, and this is also going to warm up pretty significantly over the next several weeks as well. Though we don't have very warm sea surface temperatures just yet, the warmest value right now is only 25 degrees Celsius. And, especially right off the southeast coast here, we only see 17 or 18 degrees Celsius values, probably cooler. But trust me, this is going to warm up as well. And, even all these, values out here in the open subtropics are also going to warm up too. We're probably going to see widespread 25, 26s begin to show up by the time we get to May and June, and definitely beyond. And then, let's take a look at a satellite picture of the Atlantic. And this is definitely something that we're going to start doing more often over the next several weeks, especially as we get closer towards hurricane season. Although there's really not really much to look at right now. It looks like there's a front that's coming off the United States here, as you can see by all these clouds that are kind of strung together. And one thing you can see that is present across the entire basin right now, very, very strong upper level winds, strong wind shear. Obviously, that is not favorable at all for development of tropical systems, but that is typical of this time of year because it's only late March and we're still not in, hurricane season mode yet, or summer mode, when, the wind shear typically dies down and becomes more favorable for tropical development. Although this year might be a little bit higher because obviously we're going to be dealing with El Nino. But we're going to watch this map over the next several weeks. We're probably going to come back to it periodically and just generally see how things begin to evolve here as we get closer towards hurricane season. All right, really quickly, before we wrap up, I want to talk about, United States weather right now and taking a look at the severe weather potentially for today. And luckily, in terms of actual severe weather, when we're talking about thunderstorms, not going to get much of that across the United States today, but looks like we might have a pretty critical day for fire weather for many areas across the United States. One area potentially in the southeast here where we have a level 2 risk area for fire weather, and level 1 in general extends throughout the southeast, and then throughout the mid to northern plains here as well. Especially in Nebraska, Iowa, into Minnesota, and stretching back here into Wyoming and even portions of the Southwest. Potentially a pretty, significant day for fire weather today. And in fact, let's go to the National Weather Service homepage to see the watches and warnings in effect right now. And there are a bunch of red flag warnings in effect, once again, throughout the entire Southeast. And also as well throughout the mid and northern plains for today. So pretty decent fire weather. We might see some brush fires, and hopefully we won't see another, major wildfires spark up. But something that we've been dealing with over the last several weeks, and kind of is a product of the climate situation that we are in now. And I'm, you could interpret that in many different ways, but I'm mainly talking about especially how the atmosphere has responded over the last several years, because we've seen a lot of La Niñas in place. That generally creates a lot of drought conditions throughout large portions of the United States, and many places as well, especially further west this year, has seen really above normal conditions and not a lot of rain. And in many places as well, not just rain, but precipitation in general has been well below normal. And not just with rain, but with snow too. So that's creating a lot of drought conditions for many. And obviously because of that, we have an increased risk in fire weather. And that looks like that'll be in full force today. So make sure to be careful. Don't do anything that might potentially spark brush fire. Especially if you are in a very fire-prone area today, because, especially if conditions are ripe, simple brush fire sometimes can spark and grow massively and quickly into a huge wildfire, as we've seen happen in the past. So make sure to be careful with that today if you are in the risk area. But We're going to obviously continue to watch El Nino over the next several weeks, and we'll see just how strong this El Nino is actually going to get this year. But it looks like favorable conditions are coming up over the next several weeks that we might see this really begin to kick into overdrive. But of course, we'll have to see it play out before we can know for sure that that is what's going to happen. But with that being said, I'm going to end it off for this week. Hope you enjoyed this week's tropical weather outlook. Going to continue to do these on Saturday. I know I said I was going to start doing these on Thursday, but looks like, sometimes you try something and it doesn't work. So we're just going to go back to doing this on Saturday. So hope you enjoy the rest of your week. And I hope I'll see you once again next week on Saturday for another tropical weather outlook. Stay safe out there. Enjoy the rest of your week. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. I'll talk to you guys again next week.